to Chapter 1, Homecoming Call. David Mitchell was a soldier coming home from a long time in Vietnam. He was excited and nervous. From San Francisco, he called his parents, Martha and George. They answered the phone, and David said, "Mom, Dad, I'm coming home. I have a favor to ask. I want to bring a friend with me." His parents were happy and said, "Of course, we'd love to meet him." David then said, "My friend Michael got hurt badly. He lost an arm and a leg in the war. He has nowhere to go, and I want him to live with us." Martha and George listened closely, but they were worried. Martha said, "I'm sorry to hear that, son. Maybe we can help him find somewhere to live." David insisted, "No, Mom and Dad, I want him to live with us." George replied, "Son, we don't know if we can handle that. It might be very hard for us. We have our own lives, and this might make things difficult. Maybe Michael can find another place to stay." David felt upset and decided to end the call. He hung up the phone, leaving his parents worried and confused. David was determined to bring Michael home, but his parents' reaction made him feel uncertain and sad about what to do next. Chapter 2, The Parents' Dilemma. Martha and George sat at their kitchen table, talking about David's call. Martha was concerned and said, "George, I'm worried about David's friend. I know he needs help, but this might be too much for us." George nodded. "I agree. Michael will need special care. We have our daily routines and responsibilities. I'm not sure how we can manage this." Martha sighed, "But I feel guilty. David really wants Michael to come home with us. What if we could at least help him find a place nearby?" George thought for a moment. "Maybe that's a good idea. We can try to find some support for Michael. It's just that having him here might be very challenging." They both felt sad and torn. They wanted to help, but were afraid of the difficulties it might bring. The conversation ended with both parents feeling unsure about how to handle the situation and worried about their son's return. Chapter 3, The Final Conversation. David hung up the phone, feeling frustrated. He was disappointed that his parents did not fully support his request to bring Michael home. He had hoped they would understand and be willing to help his friend. Martha and George sat in silence after the call, feeling a mix of emotions. Martha whispered, "I hope David is okay. I'm worried about him." George shook his head. "I don't know what to do. I just hope he doesn't feel too hurt by our reaction." It's hard to know what's best. David, sitting alone in his apartment, thought about the conversation. He felt a heavy weight on his shoulders. He wanted to be with his friend Michael, but feared what his parents' reaction meant for his own future. He wondered if his return home would be possible, or if he would have to face more difficulties alone. Chapter 4, A Shocking Tragedy. A few days after the call, Martha and George received a terrible phone call from the San Francisco police. The officer said, "I'm sorry to inform you that your son, David Mitchell, has died after falling from a building. We believe it was a suicide." Martha's hands shook as she held the phone. "Oh no, this can't be true." George's face went pale. "We need to go to San Francisco. We have to see David." Filled with grief, Martha and George made plans to fly to San Francisco. Their hearts were heavy with sadness, and they couldn't believe their son was gone. They prepared to identify his body, hoping to find some answers about what had happened. Chapter 5. The Identification. Martha and George arrived at the San Francisco morgue, their hearts aching. They were led to a room where David's body was laid out. They looked at him, their tears falling freely. When they saw David's body, they were horrified. David was missing an arm and a leg, just like the friend he had wanted to bring home. Martha cried, "Oh my goodness, David had the same injuries as Michael." George could barely speak. "This is so shocking. We didn't know he was hurt too." The realization was overwhelming. David had been hiding his own injuries, and his parents were devastated by the discovery. They were left with deep sadness and many unanswered questions. Chapter 6. Flashbacks of War. In David's memories, the scenes of war came alive. David was in the jungle, facing danger every day. Explosions and gunfire surrounded him. He remembered the moment he stepped on a landmine, feeling pain as he lost his arm and leg. He thought of his friend Michael, who was also hurt in the same way. David had tried to stay strong, but the war had taken a heavy toll on him. He felt he had to protect Michael, who had become like family to him. These memories showed how difficult David's time in Vietnam was, and how he had tried to shield his parents from the full truth of his suffering. Chapter 7. David's Inner Conflict. David sat alone, thinking deeply about his decision. He knew that returning home with his injuries might be very hard for his parents. He felt he would be a burden, not only to them, but to himself. David remembered how he had used Michael's story as a way to see if his parents would be ready to accept someone with disabilities. His own pain was hidden behind the story of his friend. David wondered if he could live with his parents and be a source of constant worry for them. The weight of his decision became too much for him. David's inner struggle and fear of being a burden to his family grew stronger, leading him to make a heartbreaking choice. Chapter 8. The Parents' Realization. Martha and George tried to make sense of David's actions. They remembered their conversations and the clues David had given. They realized that David had been suffering from the same injuries as Michael. Martha said softly, "David was testing us to see if we would accept Michael. He wanted us to be prepared for his own condition too." George nodded sadly. "We didn't understand his pain. We didn't know how much he was struggling. He must have felt so alone." The realization of David's hidden suffering filled them with deep regret. They wished they had been more understanding and supportive, and they felt profound sorrow for their son's hidden battles. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Martha and George tried to cope with their grief and the shock of David's death. They talked about their feelings and how to honor David's memory. They realized that they needed to find a way to help others who were dealing with similar struggles. Martha said, "We need to do something to help veterans like David. We can't let his story be forgotten." George agreed. "We should reach out to organizations that support veterans. It's the least we can do to honor David's sacrifice." They decided to channel their pain into action, hoping to make a difference and provide support for others who faced the hidden wounds of war. Chapter 10: Finding Peace. Martha and George worked hard to support veterans and raise awareness about the challenges they face. They found comfort in helping others and in remembering David's bravery and sacrifice. They visited veterans' organizations, shared David's story, and advocated for better support for those returning from war. Through their efforts, they found a sense of purpose and peace. Martha said, "We've learned so much from David's story. We can make a difference by helping others." George added, "David's memory will live on through the lives we touch and the support we provide." In the end, Martha and George found solace in their mission and in honoring their son's legacy. Moral of the story: the parents in this story are like many of us. We find it easy to love those who are good-looking or fun to have around, but we don't like people who inconvenience us or make us feel uncomfortable. We would rather stay away from people who aren't as healthy, beautiful, or smart as we are. Thankfully, there's someone who won't treat us that way. Someone who loves us with an unconditional love that welcomes us into the forever family, regardless of how messed up we are. Tonight, before you tuck yourself in for the night, say a little prayer that God will give you the strength you need to accept people as they are and to help us all be more understanding of those who are different from us.